Before 2018, I'd seen Dr John Dickson on TV a few times, being asked to defend Christianity or explain the Christian worldview. I've been fortunate this year to attend 3 events hosted by the Centre for Public Christianity for their new documentary, For the Love of God, which is fantastic. May I recommend it highly. The movie is inspirational. The talks by John and his colleagues Simon Smart and Justine Toe afterwards have been clarifying and insightful. I look forward to gaining more insight and clarity this morning. We're going to have a short video, and then after that video, would you please welcome Dr. John Dickson to the stage? Thank you.
I'm utterly ashamed of it. I'm ashamed that the name of Christ has ever been associated with a bomb or an AK-47.
The history of the West has been mostly Christian, and that history is mixed.
Here is where the Crusades began.
Salvation for taking up the sword.
The Crusaders burst through and slaughtered men, women, and children.
There are plenty of circumstances for Christians, as indeed for Muslims. Religion is a really good banner to march under.
This was where Adolf Hitler proclaimed his vision for the Third Reich. And what was the Christian church doing in response to the unfolding madness?
Should Christianity be understood as oppressive for women or as liberating?
The Hammer of She-Witches was a bestseller for about 200 years.
This is one of the most beautiful places in Hawaii. It's also a natural prison.
Diseases, land grabs, and outright massacres led to the annihilation of entire communities.
To lose the land was a tragedy.
Even though we aspire to this idea of living in God's image, we often fail palpably.
What does it look like when the church exists for others?
There's no denying that Christians have sometimes played completely out of tune, but they've also played it beautifully and with lasting effect.
Join us as we travel the globe and back through history to uncover the truth. The church is better and worse than you ever imagined.
Governor, honoured guests, thank you so much for this invitation to speak to you about my journey to Christian faith. That was the brief I've been given. I certainly didn't grow up thinking I would make documentaries about the history of Christianity, but I'm very glad to be here to share my story, and I hope that the hosts don't mind if I share my story of faith while offering some comments about the state and significance of Christianity in Australia. My upbringing was typical of the secularizing trend of the 1970s. Do you like that photo? When my mum met my dad, she was a churchgoer, and he went to the races on Sunday. So in order to see each other, she gave up church, he gave up the races. And as a result, my brothers and I had no religion in our life. Not once had I been to church before I was 16. We never said grace around the meal table. I'd never been to Sunday school or anything like that. And yet, I remember having a hunch about God. And I don't really know where that hunch came from. My father died in a major air disaster when I was 9 years of age. And a few days after the accident, I approached my mum and asked her, why did God let Dad's plane crash? She has no recollection what she said to me. I don't really know where that question came from, but here was this little secular Aussie kid faced with that kind of disaster. I knew the right question to ask. I also remember praying the Lord's Prayer in the years following my father's death. I had no idea what it meant to say, "Our Father which art in heaven," but I would say it. And it puzzled me how I even knew the Lord's Prayer, having never stepped inside a church. It turns out I learnt it from this woman on the screen. And the reason I found out that I learnt it from her was I was 20 years later speaking in a church in Mosman where I grew up, telling the story of how miraculous it was that as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, I somehow knew the Lord's Prayer, just miraculously intuited this prayer that Christians pray. And this woman, Elsie Faithorn, came up to me after the sermon and said, "John, don't be ridiculous. I was your babysitter for those years and I taught you the Lord's Prayer. Nothing miraculous about it." God bless the Elsie Faithorns of the world. Well, the same pattern of churchlessness and yet belief is found in the best research into the history of Australia and contemporary spiritual beliefs. The signs of secularization are everywhere. At the very time I was not going to church, Manning Clark, the great Australian historian, was describing Australia as a story of a people walking away from God. Around the same time, the great historian of religion in Australia, Patrick O'Farrell of the University of New South Wales, said in an essay, "Perhaps Australia can be understood best as the first genuinely post-Christian society." And we see the fruits of this in, of course, the recent census. Back in 2011, 61% of Australians still felt they could own up to being some kind of Christian. But of course, in 2016, 52% are willing to admit that. No religion in 2011 was 22%, now 30%. Very few things in the census changed that dramatically, so there is something going on. The signs of secularization are real. A recent poll by Ipsos found that 63% of Australians believe that religion has done more harm than good in the world. In the ranking of countries in this worldwide poll, we're number 4 with the lowest view of religion. And yet, there are enduring signs of belief amidst this so-called pattern of secularization. Our data tells us that 68% of Australians believe in God or a universal spirit. I'm not sure what the distinction between those two would be, given that if God exists, he is universal and spirit, but we'll just go with that. 63% of Australians believe in the possibility of miracles, and yet I love this, nearly 76% believe Jesus performed miracles, which tells you something about Australians and Jesus. They believe if anyone did miracles, it was him. More people believe he did miracles than think miracles are possible. And the latest data tells us that 15% of Australians attend church at least once a month. That may sound low, but compare it to sport, the other religion in this country. Almost as many Australians attend church at least once a month, 3.5 million, as play any form of organised sport or physical activity in an entire year. It doesn't quite get the press. Or consider this, more Australians will attend church this week, 1.6 million, than will watch either of the weekend's top-rating TV shows, My Kitchen Rules and 7 News, apparently. Or perhaps this, 2 to 3 times as many Australians will attend church this weekend as will watch ABC's flagship Q&A program on Monday night. But again, it doesn't quite get the press. Why am I saying this? Australia is neither Christian nor post-Christian, but something in between. Are you willing to accept pre-post-Christian? Maybe you have a better description. But Christianity in Australia enjoys enduring plausibility as well as heightened contestability. These two things, I think, were described beautifully by Sir Keith Hancock in his Boyer lecture from way back in 1976. This academic who understood Australian culture well, in the middle of his lecture said, "I want to tell you a parable about Australia. that will highlight how to think of Australians and religion. He said, imagine two agnostic Aussies half drunk at a pub. Reasonably easy to imagine. And they get into a discussion about religion. One says to the other, I bet you can't even say the Lord's Prayer. You know, the Our Father and so on. The other said, oh, of course I can. He said, okay, say it. He thought about it a little moment and said, now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. The other one said, damn it, there's your two, Bob. Sir Keith Hancock told the story and said, you can tell that parable either as evidence of how pagan Australians are. Not only do they not know the Lord's Prayer, they don't know that they don't know the Lord's Prayer. Or as evidence that even agnostic, half-drunk Australians still have the memory of an echo of the Christian faith deep in their culture. Hancock said, that is how I understand Australians' relationship to the Christian faith, the memory of an echo of a Christian faith deep in culture. This mixed situation is borne out more recently in McCrindle research, which explored the top 10 impressions of Christians in Australia. Consider these top 10. Hypocritical, opinionated, old-fashioned, judgmental, traditional. That doesn't sound too fun. But look at the top 5. Faithful, honest, kind, loving, caring. Now, how is this? Are these different cohorts? You know, there's a kind of smallish cohort that thinks of Christians as hypocritical, judgmental, and all that. And then there's a slightly larger cohort that tips over into the top 5 that thinks of Christians as caring and so on. Or is it the same people who find themselves thinking about Christians and in one moment thinking, yeah, they're hypocritical, they're judgmental. But boy, oh boy, they're caring. There's a mixed perception of Christianity and Christians in our culture. It's in this context that I've been working on this documentary, For the Love of God, which is in cinemas at the moment, but you'll be able to see it free on national TV come October, November. So look out for that. But it's about how the church is better and worse than you ever imagined. It's about the mixed impression of Christian history. But maybe this was always the case in Australian culture. Maybe it was always the case that Australians almost had two Christianities in their mind, because there is an extraordinary poem written by Henry Lawson called Christ of the Never. He had heard about a bush preacher called Peter McLaughlin, a genuine historical figure in the 1800s, who was shunned by the church, but he would travel out to the Never Never country preaching to settlers. And Lawson heard a bit about him and wrote this poem, which I would like to read to you, which is simultaneously a praise of the Christ figure of this bush preacher and a criticism of the church. Listen to these words. With eyes that seem shrunken to pierce to the awful horizons of land, through the haze of hot days and the fierce white heat waves that flow on the sand, through the Neverland, westward, norward, bronzed, bearded, gaunt on the track, quiet-voiced, hard-knuckled, rides forward the Christ of the outer outback. He works where the hearts of all nations are withered in flame from the sky, where the sinners work out their salvations in a hell upon earth ere they die. In the camp or the lonely hut lying in a waste that seems out of God's sight. He's the doctor, the mate of the dying, through the smothering heat of the night. By his work in the hells of the shearers, where the drinking is ghastly and grim, where the roughest and worst of his hearers have listened bareheaded to him. By his paths through parched desolation, hot rides and the terrible tramps. By the hunger, the thirst, the privation of his work in the furthermost camps. By his worth in the light that shall search men and prove aye and justify each, I place him in front of all churchmen who feel not, who know not, but preach. Do you feel the sting from our great agnostic poet? It is as though Australians have two Christianities in their head, and you can see it in that poem. A Christianity that is doubted and despised. A Christianity that is half believed and loved. And I believe the way Christians speak and act in the public square activates one or other of those impressions Australians have toward the Christian faith. You can, in the way you engage in public, activate the hated form of Christianity. Or, with the same people, you can activate the Christianity they long for, they love. Well, I thank God that my introduction to the Christian faith came through a genuine Christ figure. Her name is Glenda Weldon. She was my high school scripture teacher. It is one of those oddities in Australia that many states still have those half-hour-a-week scripture lessons in public schools. This woman came to Mossman High School, and when I was in year 9, so 15 or 16 years of age, she taught scripture. I listened because she was smart and funny and generous and had answers to all of my smart aleck questions. Then she did something that I know would now be illegal, and I don't recommend it. She invited the class to her home on Friday afternoons for hamburgers, milkshakes, and scones. And we thought we could put up with a little more Bible from this woman for the hamburgers, fair trade. We turned up at her home, a beautiful Mossman mansion, which she just threw open to us. Sometimes we turned up those Friday afternoons with 20 people from the class. And she fed us her hamburgers, milkshakes, and scones, so much so that we were at the point where we couldn't have got up out of the couch anyway if we wanted to, and at which point she brought out the Bible. And I distinctly remember, perhaps she is a witch, and she's going to do something mysterious to us. She didn't. She asked if we had questions, and she read to us the Gospels. A brilliant strategy with kids who had never walked inside a church. We went back the next Friday afternoon, she read to us all 4 Gospels. She knew that it would be the person of Jesus Christ, in his power and humility, in his teaching and miracles, in his death and resurrection, that might captivate these kids, and she was right. From that one class, 5 of us within a year had embraced the Christian faith. 3 of us from the one class are now full-time clergymen around the world. I remember going up to her after class once. I approached her after class once when I was really quite interested in what she was saying, and I said to her, I'm not saying God is true, but if he were, what do you think he thinks of me? I now realize that's a silly question to ask a very clever Christian. She said, I'll never forget these words, she said, John, God can see everything you've done, said, and thought. And she left a very awkward pause. And I remember thinking, oh no. And then she said, but he loves you, even still. I thanked her for a comment. I shot down the stairwell out into the playground, in some ways trying to forget that moment, and yet the words went round and round in my head for days. God sees everything I've done, said, and thought. I knew that wasn't good news. But I also knew it had to be true. If there's a God, he knows everything. And yet, she said, he loves you even still. And I thought to myself, if that is true, I've got to know about it. So I kept on going back, Friday afternoon after Friday afternoon, where I learnt the life of Jesus, where I learnt about his magnificent convictions and his compassion. And this woman, Glenda, actually embodied these twin themes of the Christian gospel. Because I remember on one occasion, one Friday afternoon, we stole her DVD player right out of her lounge room. I say we, it wasn't me, okay? But we saw it happen. The next Friday, for our hamburger session, she just mentioned in passing that she seems to have lost her DVD player. And if anyone knows where it might be, she'd love to hear about it. A few months later, my friends and I were at I must admit, a drunken party. We're 16 years of age. One of my friends, Daniel, begged us not to take him home because he was so far gone, his father wouldn't appreciate it. And then we realized at midnight, with Daniel almost collapsing, that the scripture teacher's house was only 500 meters from the party. Maybe she'll look after him for the night. The fact that we thought that was plausible tells you the kind of person she was. We knock on her door at midnight. Interrupt, I kid you not, a very posh dinner party. She doesn't bat an eyelid. She shows us straight past her guests into the back of the house, collects some clean pajamas from her son, says, look, throw Daniel in the shower, wash him, put him in clothes, throw him in the back room, and we'll come back in the morning and we'll deal with it. The thing is, she was a teetotaler. She had never touched alcohol. She was always honored us about our drinking. But when faced with that moment, she knew condemnation wasn't the theme of the moment, but compassion. We went back the next morning to collect Daniel, and there she was in the kitchen making bacon and eggs, not that he looked much like he wanted it, chatting to him about Jesus Christ and his love. Friends, when you have a Christian like that in your life, it is the easiest thing in the world to believe that God sees everything and loves you at the same time. My scripture teacher had quite an influence. And I kept up with her through the last 25 more years, 30 years. Had the privilege of taking my own children to her home on several occasions, and as a joke, she would make hamburgers, milkshakes, and scones for them. She died just last year, and I dedicated my recent book to her in these words. In memory of Glenda Natasha Weldon, who put up with this godless 16-year-old and his scoundrel mates every Friday afternoon after school, as we ate her hamburgers and scones, debated her God and lost, listened to her read and explain the four Gospels, took advantage of her generosity, caused her frequent headaches, before eventually finding ourselves captivated by the story she told about the man from Nazareth. Humanly speaking, I owe my Christian faith to this woman and the story she told us about Christ. But I also owe my academic life to her, to be honest. Her leading me through the Gospels as a 16-year-old struck a love for the life of Jesus that has never left me, that launched me on an academic career studying the historical Jesus in a secular university context. Most people have no idea how large the field of historical Jesus studies really is. Macquarie University, which has the largest ancient history department in the Southern Hemisphere, where I did my doctoral work and was a fellow for many years, in Section B would have more historical Jesus works, I don't mean theological works, historical Jesus works, than it would have works on the historical Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar combined. This is not to say Jesus therefore wins, it is to say this is a giant field of study. At Sydney University, where I now teach a 26-hour course on the historical Jesus, I say to my students, unless you've read perhaps 20 historical Jesus volumes or sat through an entire course at university, you probably will have no idea how large the field is. It's impossible to watch the latest SBS documentary or read the latest skeptical article and have a sense of what scholarship really thinks of Jesus. The reality is, while skepticism dominated the first 200 years of Jesus' scholarship, nowadays, in the last, say, 40 years, there is an overwhelming consensus in secular scholarship that we know an awful lot about the figure of Jesus, that the Gospels actually portray a real first-century life. This goes right up to including the resurrection. Not because secular scholars have become more open to miracles, probably not, but because it is now perfectly clear. The evidence for the resurrection is early and widespread, so early and widespread that even the most secular scholar will agree. We have exactly the kind of evidence a resurrection would leave behind, and more evidence pointing in that direction than we could ever expect if it had been made up. And one of the themes that is studied by all historical Jesus scholars, regardless of their faith or lack of faith, is a theme I've already touched on, a theme Henry Lawson longed for, and my scripture teacher embodied. Scholars refer to it as the friend of sinners theme. The friend of sinners theme. The passage just read to us from Luke 5 exemplifies the theme, but the data is overwhelming. Jesus wined and dined with the tax collectors and sinners, reminding us that sinners can be white collar or blue collar or no collar at all. But Jesus wined and dined, and the Pharisees asked repeatedly through the Gospels, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" We know the Pharisees' views of tax collectors and sinners. Here are texts not from the Scriptures, but from 50 years before Jesus, the so-called Psalms of Solomon, written by Pharisees in Jerusalem about 50 BC. The destruction of the sinner is forever, and he will not be remembered when God looks after the righteous. See, O Lord, raise up for your people their king, the son of David, the Messiah in other words, and drive out the sinners from the inheritance to smash the arrogance of sinners like a potter's jar. That's how Pharisees viewed sinners. Can you imagine Jesus wining and dining with them in this light? A generation or two after Jesus, we have this again from Pharisees. This is about household purity and who you can have in your home or not. Concerning tax collectors who enter the house is unclean. Concerning thieves who enter the house, only the place trodden by the feet of thieves is unclean. In other words, thieves are better than tax collectors. And if there is a Gentile with them, that is someone who's not of the tribe of the Pharisees, everything is unclean. In this context, Jesus wining and dining with sinners is remarkable, friends. His love for the outsider, white collar, blue collar, no collar, is remarkable. And every secular historical Jesus scholar writes about that theme in their works. I'll never forget meeting Gezer Vermesh before he died. I got to interview him for a documentary that we showed on Channel 7 some years ago. Vermesh was professor of Jewish studies at the University of Oxford for 30 years. He'd written 8 books on Jesus. He's one of the world's leading authorities on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I was to interview him about Jesus and the ethic of love. And when I turned up, Vermesh said, "John, you know Jesus got his doctrine of love from Judaism. Do you know that?" I said, "Yes, Professor Vermesh. I've read that somewhere." And then he said, but he radicalized it, so that love of neighbor now meant love of enemy, love of sinner, love of tax collector, love of leper, love of Gentile. It was quite a thing to be reminded by the world's leading Jewish scholar of the radical love of Christ. A love, of course, you see, above all, in his death. What the meals of Jesus conveyed to sinners. His cross, embodied literally, where, according to his own words, in multiple sources, his blood was for forgiveness of sins. He could welcome people to his table, though he knew everything they'd done, said, and thought, because he knew he would bear into himself their judgment so they could be forgiven, so they could know God's love. I was very struck by the governor's remark, his father's advice. I don't have the exact words, but something like, never get in the way of someone's experience of the cross. Because in the cross, you experience the God of great conviction and compassion. The one who knows us through and through. And yet, instead of judging, offers forgiveness. My scripture teacher embodied this powerfully. She enabled me to hear this Christian message, to know that I was loved despite myself. And she also set me on the course of what it means to do public Christianity. Because in these times where Christianity is enduringly plausible and increasingly contested, there seems to be only one way to engage the public world, and that is shaped by the cross, not getting in the way of someone's experience of the cross. Or to put it another way, to recover the genius of Jesus, who was able to flex two muscles at the same time. The muscle of conviction and the muscle of compassion. I apologize for this sexist version. How about that? Do you prefer that? Jesus could thunder in public about the judgment to come on the world, and then invite himself to dinner with the person in the town you might have thought was first in line for judgment. Conviction, compassion. In the history of Christianity, sometimes the church has been all conviction and no compassion. This muscle flexed, this one atrophied. At other times in church history, perhaps especially today, it's the other way. All compassion. Jesus just wants you to know he loves you. He's not interested in changing you at all. And all the convictions are dropped. I think both are heresies. Both refuse to listen to the genius of Jesus Christ, who was all conviction and all compassion, without any contradiction. The one who could say to every one of us, I see everything you've done, said, and thought. And I love you even still. Who could say, yes, there is a judgment to come, but I have given my life on a cross that you might be forgiven. That is both the gospel message and the ethos of doing public Christianity, friends. May we all experience the cross. And those of us who already believe, may we never get in the way of someone's experience of the cross.